So I just woke up. I'm just going to look at my step 3 results now. I just had an email saying that they were released. It's currently March 15. I'm a bit surprised because I thought there was going to be a scheduled delay in schedule 3 reporting early this year. I didn't feel too good about the exam coming out of it. It felt like I was guessing a lot of the questions. Honestly, about half of the test, I felt like I was choosing between um, two or more options actually. So we'll see how it goes. I did score okay in UWorld. I think I was averaging about 65 to 70% in the end. And for the free 120 equivalent of step 3, I got 85% a couple of days before the actual exam. So we'll see how it goes. Hopefully I did okay. Yes! Oh my god! 249, okay, passed. Whoa! Okay. So I just got my step 3 results back, and I've got so many thoughts as well as reflections to share with you all about how to optimize and score as best as you can for this exam. So first, starting off with the structure of step 3. So it's a 2-day exam. On day 1, it's focused on the foundational sciences. So you'll be encountering content similar to what you saw in step 1, things that focus on mechanisms of actions as well as pathologies. And you'll also be doing a lot of biostats on day 1 as well. Day 2 is focused on the clinical sciences, so this is more similar towards step 2 CK, but you'll also be working through simulated cases on day 2. So these simulated cases are unique to the step 3 of the USMLE series, and they basically involve you working through this special software that showcases specific clinical encounters, whether it's in an office setting or an emergency department or a hospital or inpatient unit setting, and it gives you a clinical vignette that you read and then you work through. You place orders like you might do in an actual EMR, and you can advance time to see the patient's progress throughout their hospital or clinical journey. In terms of eligibility for this exam, so in order to take this exam, you must have passed step 1 as well as step 2, and you must have graduated medical school. In terms of when to take this exam, I'd recommend doing it in your intern year, while all of the knowledge from medical school is still relatively fresh in your head, but you've had some clinical experience as well during your internship. In terms of when to take it during internship, I think this would vary between person to person depending on their circumstances. If you're in a residency that's not clinically focused and you don't work through a traditional intern year, such as in a pathology residency, perhaps it's worthwhile to actually take it towards the beginning of your internship. That way you're still very fresh from medical school. In contrast, if you are working with a lot of specialties that are represented in the exam, such as in emergency medicine or internal medicine, perhaps it's worthwhile, perhaps you have the opportunities to actually delay it towards the end of intern year while you work through the crux of internship, and then you have some time towards the end to study for it. In terms of studying resources, so I used 3 main resources and I progressed from it in this order. So first I started with AMBOSS. So I did about 500 AMBOSS style questions. This was essentially just a blitz through of these AMBOSS questions just to get a feel of the exam form as well as the content again, and to get used to the pacing because it's been quite some time since I took an exam of the USMLE series. And then after working through these 500 questions, I moved straight on to UWorld. So UWorld random untimed was what I used for the actual UWorld questions. This was by far and away the most important resource for your preparation. It's very similar in terms of breadth as well as difficulty compared to the actual step 3. Notably, UWorld also has a biostats version for step 3. I recommend doing this. It's very useful to be able to get a good grasp of the biostats equations that are used in step 3 because there's a lot of heavy representation for biostats on day 1 of the exam. And finally, the cases. There's a very useful resource called CSS Cases. You can find it just by Googling CSS Cases for USMLE Step 3 and just clicking on the first hit in Google, I believe. And this is the gold standard resource for the CS Cases preparation for day 2 of the exam. Very similar, again, to content and form of the actual CSS cases. I didn't actually finish the CSS cases before the day 2 of the exam. Instead, what I did was, in terms of my scheduling of the exam, I scheduled them back to back. So February 14 and February 15. And after I came home from day 1 of the exam, I crammed out the remaining 20 CSS cases that I had, and I worked through as many low-scoring cases that I performed in before day 2 of the exam. And this was actually quite critical there, for my performance on the actual CSS cases on day 2. So this brings me to scheduling the exam. So how should you schedule the exam? I took it back to back, mainly because I just wanted to get it over and done with, and I didn't want any overarching anxiety hanging over me after day 1 and in between day 1 and day 2. So I scheduled them back to back, February 14 and February 15. I rented a hotel room for 3 nights, just immediately adjacent to the test center. And so what I'd do was that this would enable me to have a night of sleep just before the actual testing, and then in between the testing, I'd be able to get a full night of rest. And I actually woke up just 1 hour before the actual exam on day 2, because I was just in walking proximity towards the exam. So very restful sleep, and this is something I do recommend doing. It was a big investment for me because I believe the Super Bowl was ongoing around at that time, and so people were flying in and out. And the testing center I did my test at was near the airport. But even so, I believe this was a very important investment for me. It's all about optimizing your performance on the actual day, and there's nothing superior to not having to worry about traffic, or not having to worry about whether an Uber will be available and how long the Uber takes to reach you, but instead just waking up, drinking your coffee, and then grabbing your stuff and going to the test center. So in terms of the assessment tools that I used basically all of the assessment tools available. I first did UWSA 1 to get a baseline of my performance. I scored 210 in that 4 weeks out from the exam. Next, I moved on to NBME 5. I believe this is the only current NBME that the USMLE is offering for you to practice with. I recommend doing it. I purchased it. I believe it was about $70 or so, worth it. They don't give you the actual 3-digit score, but they give you a raw score that you can convert to a 3-digit score through online, essentially. And I scored about a 230, a 3-digit equivalent on this one. And then I did UWSA 2. I scored 233 on this 1 week out. And 3 days out, I did free 127, and I scored an 85% in this. In terms of which one of these was most like the actual USMLE exam, I'd say the culmination of all of these provided the best representation for what you would encounter in Step 3, because the questions for Step 3 and the way they ask it is just so diverse. It's so useful having as many different perspectives, as well as going through as many different forms as you possibly can to get the best representation of what to expect from Step 3. So my final thoughts for this exam: it is a difficult exam. I myself, walking out of that exam, I felt so uncomfortable compared to Step 1 as well as Step 2. I thought this was the most difficult part of the USMLE series, and that's because it encounters both information from your foundational years in medical school as well as your clinical years in medical school, and also the sort of stuff that you're doing in your internship as well. So many different things to pay attention to, and for me, I'm internal medicine focused, so a lot of the other specialties such as pediatrics and obstetrics gynecology, the ins and outs of that was something that was fading for me. So one thing that I did do for Step 3 that I didn't do in my Step 1 and Step 2 preparation was actually take a lot of notes. And that's because for Step 1, obviously you have first aid available, and Step 2, you're going through clinical rotations at that time as well. But in step 3, I felt like reading resources was such a passive use of time, and since you're on such a time crunch during intern year, it's not the best investment of your time. Instead of reading, I'd read in great detail the question banks rather than reading an actual textbook or other resource. But the actual question bank, when I'm working through the questions, and if I encounter an obstetrics gynecology question that touches on a topic that I may not necessarily have encountered since my OBGYN clerkship, then I'd read the answer in a very lot of detail, and I'll take notes on the ins and outs of that while working through it. And I thought that was the most efficient use of my time there. Otherwise, there's that traditional notion that you need 2 months for step 1 and 2 weeks for step 2 and a 2B pencil for step 3. I can see why people might say that because, we're not applying for residency anymore, but walking out of that exam, it just felt so foreign and it felt so difficult. The difficulty of the exam must have increased dramatically over the past few years or something, and I know that they're working on some content changes at the beginning of this year as well, which may account for some of the unfamiliar questions that came through. But overall, I think don't underestimate step 3. For me, once again, it was the most difficult of the 3-part USMLE series. But if you do prepare well through UWorld Question Bank as well as CSS cases, those 2 resources in particular, I think you'll be fine for the exam as long as you're scoring well on the benchmarks that you're doing with your assessment tools. One thing that I didn't mention was Amboss Knowledge Bank. Very high yield resource. That was what I used to research UWorld questions in more detail when I was not too sure about the content of it. So that's about it for my reflections of taking step 3. If you have any questions or comments, I'm more than happy to answer them. And best of luck to everyone who's taking this exam.